The Kiros Report is honored to bring to its domain Professor Neil Roberts, a personal friend of mine who happens to be an associate dean of the faculty at Williams College. Williams College is the #1 college among national liberal arts colleges in the country. Who is also the John B. McCoy and John T. McCoy Professor of African Studies, Political Theory, and the Philosophy of Religion. Professor Roberts was president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association from 2016 to 19, and he served for several years on the prestigious Political Theory as one of its executive directors. Among his numerous works and articles marked by their analytic acuity and imagination are the likes of Conversations with Cornel West, which I edited and to which he presented a foreword with the great George Yancey. Additionally, I might also express my gratitude for him to take time from his busy schedule of deaning and wrote a brilliant foreword to my forthcoming book, Zara Jacob's Inauguration of Modernity. He has also contributed articles and chapters on this extraordinary idea of creolizing the canon, as he calls it, Black radicalism, totalitarianism, and modern politics. His work has appeared in periodicals such as the Caribbean Philosophical Association's journal called the CLR James Journal, Contemporary Political Theory, the Journal of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and the Humanities, Perspectives on Politics, Small Acts and Theory and Event. I could say considerably more, but I think I should stop here. Unless our structured time is overtaken by a long introduction. Welcome to the Kiros Report.
Thank you very much, Professor Kiros.
Well, one doesn't know how to begin. For me, beginnings are very different, very difficult and very different. And of course, naturally, endings are also. But beginnings are very hard. So let me begin with the following question. This idea of creolizing is really arresting. And your readers and admirers in private emails have asked me to ask you to expound on that trope, on that concept, which I think is one of the organizing principles of all your work. Particularly the most recent work on Hannah Arendt, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which he did with the great Jean, and many others.
Yeah. So again, thank you for having me with you and your viewers. And so I want to start out before getting right to creolizing, by giving some of the background. That'll be helpful. So I would say much of my work, not only in the past, but also in the present, has been particularly in the area that we might call Africana thought, Africana with an A. And if we understand, as I do, Africana thought as being a particularly modern mode of inquiry, and by modern, there are different dates and time periods that persons might use to think about the modern period. But when thinking about Africana thought, I think of a single date, October 12th, 1492. October 12th, 1492, as scholars such as Sylvia Wynter and Enrique Dussel and others have noted, is the moment in which what we now call the Bahamas is where Columbus and his first crew, when thinking he was going to Asia and then ended up in what we would now call the New World, the Americas, landed on in the Bahamas. And it is at that period and then the subsequent not only conquests and spreads of diseases and also the Atlantic slave trade and the like um, it were inaugurated, but also what at least I come to understand as not only our modern and contemporary notions of race, but also racial difference. And if we think of Africana thought as a modern mode of inquiry that is not just about reflecting on events from 1492 to the present, it's also reflecting on events and actions and peoples and figures and movements prior to that time. But if we think of the kind of the field as something that is inaugurated in that October 12th, 1492 moment, then I have organized my body of work, if you will, around what I consider three questions. And Professor, that will then get us to creolizing in a moment. So there are three questions that I would argue animate Africana thought as a modern mode of inquiry. The first I call the identity question. The second, the equality question. And the third, the freedom question. The identity question, the first one, can be simply stated as this: who am I and who are we? Right? Who am I and who are we? The second question, the equality question, is one that requires more kind of equal and in some cases more nuance, because the nuances have to do almost with the language that we use. There are many who equate equality and egalitarianism, and these are not synonyms. So when thinking about the equality question, we have to think about two ideas of equality: one that we may call a vertical equality, and the other horizontal equality. Vertical equality is a world in which there's imagine a kind of hierarchical world. So I'll give a banal example and then a more serious example. A banal example to some may be, so think about college and university campuses. This is where I've inhabited most of my professional life. And imagine undergraduates that there are fresh first years and second years and third years and fourth years, for instance. And I always ask, do first year in a residential college, do first year students have the same options and resources that a second year has, right? There's certain dormitories that a sophomore has access to apply that, for instance, a first year doesn't. And similarly, there's certain classes that first, second, and third years can or cannot apply to that someone who's about to graduate in their last year can, right? In other words, between groups, there's a hierarchy, but within groups, right? Within a first year, within a second year, within a third year, within a fourth year, there are similar access to resources. Now let's take something more serious. The United States, for instance, and in the wake of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The separate but equal doctrine, a doctrine with regards to races, which then said, at least legally, that different individuals categorized by a racial group had to be racially separate, and yet ostensibly the term was equal. But as we know, in the moment in which the ruling happened, and then even as we continue to study and rethink what happened during Jim Crow segregation, differences between those racialized as white and those racialized as Black, for instance, did not actually have the same access to resources as one another. And so the challenge in modern Africana thought is, how do you create a vertically inegalitarian society into a horizontally equal society? Put differently, horizontal equality and egalitarianism are the same thing, and I'm happy to go about that. The third question, which will get us to then how to talk about creolization, as I understand it, is the freedom question. Put simply, what does it mean to be free? Is freedom the same thing, for instance, as liberation or emancipation or independence, firstly? And secondly, what, if anything, is the relationship between a conceptualization of freedom and how we understand what I take to be the ultimate unfreedom, which is enslavement? And when these three questions taken together, the identity question, the equality question, and the freedom question, are put to bear when thinking in terms of Africana thought, then for me, that has meant, how can we either tell stories that have been silenced or disavowed in our past and even in our present, but also, who are the figures and movements and kind of regions of inquiry that you and I and others write about and discuss in order to try and think about not only these three concepts that I had mentioned, but others. And so when thinking about, to your question with, I would slightly rephrase it. Why creolization? Why talk about creolization? Why not talk about mestizaje or hybridity or some other type of discourse? Well, to talk about creolization, we have to first look at its root. Creolization at its root comes from kind of Creole, and Creole initially referred to a white European born and raised in the Americas. So I always use the example of Empress Josephine, right? Someone who was born and raised in the French Antilles, right? The spouse of Napoleon Bonaparte. And then Creole then shifted to then refer to enslaved Africans born and raised in the so-called New World. Bozales referred to Africans who were then in the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly captured, sold, taken across the Atlantic to the Americas. But Creole then subsequently came to refer to enslaved Africans born and raised in the Americas, the so-called New World. Then, if one looks at the U.S. context, if one were to say Creole, usually you probably think of food, right? So you think of New Orleans, right? Kind of Creole food, and we think of mixture. So stick with me for one moment. Creolization now as a gerund, right? Not simply as a noun, but as a gerund, something that is, as Fanon said, actional, right? In Black Skin, White Mask, something that is kind of actional. Creolization is not like I'll use this. Imagine if this was a blender, right? What happens with a blender? You might put in, if you're having a drink, you might put in a strawberry, and you might put in grapes, you might put in some type of crush, you might put in some ice, you might put in some different elements, and you blend it, and then there's something that results. How I am not using creolization is to suggest that there are certain fixed elements in the world. So there's a fixed element A, fixed element B, fixed element C. You mix it up, and then something then results that itself is fixed. There are certain versions of creolization, such as the Creolite movement coming out of Martinique, that takes such a position. It's brilliant insofar as it describes the encounters of two or more elements coming together. However, it assumes, when thinking about Homo sapiens sapiens, when thinking about humans, it assumes that we have fixed identities, that we have fixed states in which we exist in. But if we were to understand, whether you agree with me or not, but if we can at least think about the idea of creolization as not only the encounter between one or more elements coming together, but also what is the novelty, or what Hannah Arendt calls natality, right? Newness, the kind of birth of something new. What happens when those encounters come together and then not only generate something new, but themselves going into the future orders might realign, and then novelty might then have to be rebirthed, so to speak. And getting more specifically, and then I'll stop on this point, is that how I have understood creolization, particularly when thinking about the areas that I've been most associated with, modern Africana thought in particular, work coming out of the Caribbean, African American thought, but also the literature in philosophy and political theory, among thinkers, for instance, not exclusively, who understood themselves as European. Much contemporary discourse in philosophy, political theory, and quite frankly, the humanities and social sciences often you will use something like the language of the following. There's Western, and then there's non-Western, right, thought, right? There's Western, right? And there's non-Western thought, as if Western is completely meant to be kind of European, and then in a very narrow sense, and then non-Western is supposed to encompass everything that is not that. And not only do I think Edward Glissant was right when he said the West is not in the West, it's a project, not a place, in his book Caribbean Discourse. But I've been very interested in what does it mean to think about figures and movements in Africana thought and their encounter with the ideas and movements coming out of different intellectual traditions. So point blank, in terms of what is, not only the answer of what is creolization, but why I found it kind of generative, bless you, generative, is that I think it allows us to not only think about these encounters that are continuing to go on, but also I think it brings into greater relief figures not only in the tradition of Africana thought, but also even figures such as Hannah Arendt, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who themselves actually, to truly understand even their own work, um, uh, uh, such an encounter is helpful, and it also brings into relief the ways in which there may be some lacks. There may actually be some ways in which the kind of staging of this kind of creolizing the canon actually then brings up into relief work that figures and movements themselves might justifiably be subject to critique. But what can we learn from that, right? What can we actually learn from that?
Okay, now allow me to problematize the
Sure.
application of the concept of creolizing to Hannah Arendt.
Sure.
And I'm willing to be challenged.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, I'm extremely respectful of the concept of natality, which you just mentioned, which could be squared quite harmoniously with the existentialist thesis of possibility. Natality facilitates the idea of the human to be a possibility, because it's a commemoration and a celebration of a new birth, beginning, new perspectives, new horizons, and so on. On the other hand, though, this is quite problematic because I'm not sure if I'm right. Hannah Arendt has a tendency in her reflections on violence, in particular, to be extremely unkind to Frantz Fanon, whom she dared to call a third-rate thinker. As if that is not enough, when she reflects deeply on the concept of violence, there is a tendency on her part to approve violence when it is exercised by the West and in the West against the victims of the global South, but is very quick to condemn it when the colonized exercise it, by contending that in the hands of the colonized, most particularly Blacks, it is really a criminal activity. I find this to be very disturbing. So I can imagine the possibility of theorizing Jean-Jacques Rousseau with the productions of the global South, because there is a harmoniousness that is built on the idea of compassion on the part of Rousseau. A compassion that he learned from his reading of Western anthropologists and others, which encouraged him to be inclined to be extremely kind and fascinated by the non-West, by the islanders and others. Whereas when he brings Hannah Arendt to the mix of the creolizing project, it's very disturbing, because she's criminalizing the colonized for seeking what he called freedom, which he analytically quite rightly distinguished from liberation, emancipation, and so on, as an exercise of the defense of natality, a beginning, a possibility. But not for Hannah Arendt. She did this twice, a condemnation of Fanon, and then proceeding to condemn the quests for freedom on the part of Blacks as a criminal activity.
All right. So it's a wonderful question, a very expected question, if I must say, because then again, not assuming your the familiarity of your viewers with Hannah Arendt, so I'll say a few things in terms of trying to respond. Hannah Arendt was a German Jewish emigre thinker of the 20th century, who, while formerly trained in philosophy, rejected that label, considered herself what she would call a kind of a political theorist. And it's important to state that as someone who then ended up fleeing National Socialist Germany, spent to the year half of her life in Europe and half of her life in the United States. And I say why that is an important beginning because Hannah Arendt was someone who actually wrote quite extensively with regards to what she called race thinking on the one hand, the idea of race secondarily, and then also kind of thirdly, racism. Before fleeing and then ultimately becoming naturalized in the United States. But much of that work was with regards to 19th and 20th century Europe. And so perhaps two of her most controversial works, two of the three most controversial works that Hannah Arendt published while she was in the so-called American years. One was an essay called Reflections on Little Rock with regards to the Little Rock school's desegregation of the 1950s. And the second being the work that you mentioned at the end of the 1960s, an essay that on violence that was initially published as a long essay and then subsequently the following year a book. And then a third work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, that was also considered controversial. So why even mention Hannah Arendt, with regards to the Creolizing Project, and also why I wanted to open with regards to thinking about race. In that work on violence, Hannah Arendt was trying to distill, at least as I understand it, what do we mean by violence? So you have figures like Frantz Fanon, most notably in The Wretched of the Earth, but also before that in an essay called Algeria Unveiled, more accurately translated, Algeria Unveils Herself, in which in different ways Fanon was building towards a more mature theory of revolutionary violence. And in On Violence, the book version for Hannah Arendt, in the process of trying to define what we mean by violence, and I think you're rightly so, not only in terms of Arendt's assessment of Fanon, but also Black student activists, right, on different college campuses. What she wrote in that essay has still been kind of the subject, understandably, of the ire of many readers. But I want to kind of think about, kind of come back to something that I mentioned only briefly with regards to the project of kind of creolizing the canon, which it is not a proselytizing project, meaning that it is not a project to then, especially when thinking about creolizing Hannah Arendt, for someone to then say, by staging this creolization of Hannah Arendt's thought, that is somehow meant to absolve areas of kind of critique of, in this case, a particular thinker. However, I want to just push back a little bit with regards to On Violence in terms of what I have found very generative about the book. So in the book, Arendt is right. There's many concepts that people use but don't define. So for instance, even Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, his mature theory of violence, he doesn't give a normative definition of violence. It's something that in many regards one has to parse together in his more descriptive accounts of decolonization and what Fanon writes on violence, on culture, on national culture, right? The idea of the new humanity and etc. But Arendt begins and says there are several terms that people claim are the same as violence, and they're not. And so she said there's five terms, and she spends the first part of the book talking about them. She says there's power, strength, force, authority, and violence. And then Arendt does something that is counterintuitive, where she says, before I get into those definitions, I am going to make a claim that the opposite of violence is not nonviolence. So I'm going to repeat that. Arendt makes an argument that the opposite of violence is not on violence. And in her argument in the book On Violence, she says the opposite of violence is power. And she makes a claim that power is not just human activity, but is human activity in concert. So that Power is not you or I exercising any type of action. It's that you and I and others collectively, in concert, have a form of activity. Violence, though, and this is something that I've written about with regards to Arendt before the Criminalizing Hannah Arendt book, which is I think that Hannah Arendt is incorrect in her assessment in On Violence, in which she says that not only is violence a mere instrumentality, and I think Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth makes a claim that there's an intrinsic understanding of violence, but Arendt says that not only is violence is instrumental means to an end, that it's done a means to an end, but she says violence is not only apolitical, but it's anti-political. Put differently, violence is like what Hannah Pitkin calls a space blob. It's like a blob in science fiction movies that comes from outer space that not only can come over, right, that can come over the possibility of the domain of politics and freedom, but it can smash it, right? Where she says where power is large, violence is low. Where violence is high, power not only decreases, but it can be obliterated. And in this, I think that Arendt mischaracterizes what are the brilliant intuitions, not just of Frantz Fanon, but other theorists of violence. And in Fanon's case, it's not merely violence for violence sake, but is what are that Fanon starts, right, that first paragraph of The Wretched of the Earth, Les Damnés de la Terre, where he says that decolonization is what? It is always a violent event, and that therefore there are individuals who, when their back, he says, when their back are against the wall, the back is against the wall, their genitals are subject to the electrodes of a colonizing and subjugating agent. Are there any circumstances in which a violent response to violent dehumanization is warranted? Okay. Now, two things to be noteworthy, and then I'll turn it back to you. One, what's really fascinating about On Violence is when Hannah Arendt is critiquing Frantz Fanon in On Violence, she does this I'm not a psychologist, but I think clinical psychologists probably have a term for it. She makes this statement, which is that, commenters of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth only comment on the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, On Violence, and they never go beyond the first chapter. And then Arendt in the essay On Violence only goes, no farther than the first chapter of the Wretched of the Earth. But that point that I actually want to convey to you and your listeners is and viewers is that actually when Arendt is talking about Fanon, she's actually referring to Jean-Paul Sartre's argument in the preface to The Wretched of the Earth. I'm going to say it again. Sartre made a very famous / infamous preface to The Wretched of the Earth, in which Fanon's book was already drafted. Fanon knew that he was dying of leukemia, and he wrote the book and then eventually asked Sartre to write the preface. He had just published the Critique of Dialectical Reason, and Sartre, in the preface to The Wretched of the Earth, at a certain point, 3/4 of the way through, he says the dialectic has reached a point, and I'm going to see it through. So Sartre's argument on violence in The Wretched of the Earth is actually not the argument that Fanon made. And so what's the takeaway? What I find, especially with figures and movements in the Global South, is that a figure who literally published a series of lectures at the same year that Hannah Arendt wrote On Violence, the famed Guyanese Pan-Africanist Walter Rodney. When Walter Rodney in 1968 went to a Black Writers Conference in Montreal and then was informed during the conference that he was banned by the early post-colonial government of Jamaica, he flew back to Jamaica at the end of the conference and then was turned away on the runway in Kingston Airport and then was told that he could no longer return. And much of it was because Walter Rodney, for his brief period of returning to the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, where he went as an undergraduate, he had his day job as a professor of history, and then he was fraternizing with the Rastafari movement that was still even considered a cult in early post-colonial Jamaica. And then he was banned for a series of activities that were viewed as insurgent and challenges to the post-colonial Jamaican state. Walter Rodney published lectures right soon thereafter, the same year that Arendt actually published On Violence, called Groundings with My Brothers. And in it, Rodney attempted to not only explain why he found farcical the reasons for his ban by the Jamaican state, not the people, right? as Michel Rolfe Trio, the late Haitian anthropologist, said, there's a difference between the Haitian people and the Haitian state, right? And similarly here, there's a difference between the Jamaican state that banned Walter Rodney and the Jamaican people for whom he had much love, just to be clear. But Walter Rodney, in that essay, also tried to think through someone who had joined him at the Black Writers Conference in Canada, namely Stokely Carmichael, who was the one who coined the term Black Power. And in the lectures on the groundings with my brothers, Rodney wrote about not only the term Black Power in the U.S. as Stokely Carmichael had asserted, but he wondered, does Black Power function differently in the Caribbean? And he makes this very dizzying but profound claim that he says that Black Power isn't just about phenotype. It's not just about what one ascriptively is. It's also connected to a set of ideals. And he thought that in the Caribbean, particularly the Anglophone Caribbean, that there was a related but distinct understanding of Black Power that what, in my reading, starts to sound a lot like Hannah Arendt's argument on violence with regards to power, that power is not simply an activity, but it's an activity of acting in concert. I don't have time right now to spell it out in detail, but this gets back to your point, and I'm not dodging. I think that absolutely, in terms of what you have found very unsettling. I'll use the word unsettling. You didn't use it. Unsettling in terms of Hannah Arendt's writings on violence. I would add the reflections on Little Rock with regards to her understanding of race and racial orders, and quite frankly, Black politics in the United States and the Americas. But I think that there's actually a lot to learn, not only from addressing that, but going where most commentators don't go, which is to say that even in that text, there is actually work that speaks, in my view, to many of the preoccupations by thinkers both in Rodney's time and also in our own with regards to social and political movements in the global South, in and about the global South, that I think we should have, that we should discuss. And I think it is actually no surprise that those two works, Groundings of My Brothers and On Violence, emerged at the same time. So I don't think it's coincidence. I think it's something that we, and by we I mean collectively, in terms of intellectuals and lay scholars who have been writing about this and discussing this for years, decades, have not parsed together. And so that's just one contribution that I would hope to what is the significance of creolizing Hannah Arendt, and by extension, the larger Creolizing the Canon project, which also is not staging an active creolization with European thinkers such as Hannah Arendt, but also a range of thinkers in Africana thought and movements. That this is the value. It's not the only way to approach these questions, but I think it has deep value.
Excellent. Now, we have about 30 minutes left, and I would like to use this time systematically to address on the surface 3 issues. We might not have time to delve deeply into them, but
Yes.
let's announce at least what I have in mind. They are the following. The second part of your project, which fascinates me and which unites your project with mine, is this objective attempt at extracting a political theory, a political philosophy from the imaginations and intelligences of thinkers from the global South, which in your case is particularly grounded on an understanding and interpretation of the highly original attempts on the part of African-American thinkers in particular, in the wake of slavery and the brutality of discrimination, managed to give us insights which you collect brilliantly and develop a political theory on their behalf and out of their imaginations and intelligences. I would like us to address that. And then secondly, I'm also equally fascinated by this remarkable forwards you wrote, both to Conversations with Cornel West, along with George Yancey, and the forward to Inaugurations of Modernity. my own work, which I would like us to get into. And I would like us to do this under a new rubric, which complements but also has deep tension with the trope of creolizing, namely radical Black thinking. There seems to be a tension between these two projects, which are also extending, and this is the final part of the anticipated questions that I hope you can address, to consider writing a work on a neglected giant that the Rastafarians elevated to the status of a demigod, and yet not many books have been written on him. In fact, I'm bound to say maybe one or two. The Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie. So take these three projected questions and select the ones that you can address yourself to in 30 minutes. I apologize for the breadth of the questions.
I think that we can address these actually together. So I'm going to take the opportunity to try and do this. And so you are exactly right that I have spent a great deal of time, both, or not just both, more broadly even than two areas, in a kind of teaching, my research, and my writing to really think very systematically about, yes, thinkers from the global South, but also figures in modern Africana thought that we might describe as broadly working within the area of Black political thought. Thought by those not merely from, though including Africans, but people of African descent, working in this kind of broader kind of Black political thought kind of traditions, plural. And I'll come back to why I say plural and not in the singular. And so in my work, and you know this, but in terms of kind of figures that I've written kind of extensively about. So I wrote a book on Frederick Douglass, for instance, the very important 19th century enslaved person who then became a fugitive, and then in the post-Civil War period, a kind of statesman and rhetorician and writer and public figure. The figure of Sylvia Wynter, the contemporary Jamaican thinker, born in Cuba, by the way, born in Cuba, and then returned to Jamaica 2 years with her parents and brother, who was influential in not only the thinking through and the formation of what would become post-colonial Jamaica, but also in the area of Africana thought. And when I was introduced to Wynter's work and beginning to kind of write about it, there was very little discussion of Sylvia Wynter's thought, and it seems almost overnight. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, at Harvard, one of your students, who's also an actress and a thinker in their own right, wrote a senior thesis right on Sylvia Wynter's work within the last few years, and that was something that was just not the case even a decade ago, let alone when I was doing a lot of work on Wynter. And then other figures, Angela Davis. But I also want to just mention two interrelated areas that I think are important, which is the Maroons and this idea that I call this theory called freedom is Marinage, because this does connect to the tradition of Black political thought and also how do we think about thinkers from the global South. So I became very interested earlier in my career with thinking about how do we so-called get free. Right now, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how we live free, or how do we even live in a world, whether you, I, and others are living what we imagine is our ideal version of the free life. But going back to this period in which I was very much concerned with how do we think about getting free, particularly in the wake of September 11th in 2001, I was dumbfounded in the discourse that was happening. Not only was there this resurgence of discourse of the West versus the non-West, right? Are there certain people or communities who know what freedom is, and others who simply do not? But perhaps most importantly, I wanted to begin at the time to probe if, in fact, there is a relationship between conceptions of enslavement and what does it mean to be free. I wanted to zoom in and just try and distill, right? What is that? What is that interrelationship? And um, and that's where I really spent some time thinking about the Maroons, right? The Maroons were, in some ways, this brings back to the beginning of our conversation today. Maroons, or the term kind of Maronage, M-A, sometimes it's M-A-R-R-O-N-A-G-E or M-A-R-R-N. But nonetheless, the term Maronage is it just translates. It's a word in French that means flight. It's a noun that has the effect of a verb. And so I became very interested in the historical as well as contemporary Maroons, but particularly the historical Maroons, particularly in the 16th century to the 18th century and early 19th century, individuals who were on kind of plantations in the Caribbean, plantations in the what would become the United States of America, individuals who were enslaved persons who then ended up either by themselves, taking flight from the plantations for an hour or a couple hours or an afternoon at a time for just sustenance, mental sustenance, or those who are then trying to organize about possible forms of escape with individuals on other plantations, to collective groups that who didn't believe that overturning the slave regime, or what I call the slaveocracy, was possible in their lifetime. And so collectives of individuals who then, in some sense, circumscribed to create a kind of a collective community of runaways within a larger plantation order. And that's historically the general narrative of how Maroons and Maronage have been thought of. Very kind of powerful stories and lived experiences, but still, when one talks about the Maroons and freedom, it's a very kind of Janus face history. And so I was really interested in saying, what if we were to zoom out through space and time and say, from antiquity to millennia into the future, what if we were to think about freedom as a flight from some form of flight from the condition of enslavement, but not actually what John Hope Franklin and others in his wake talked about as moving literally physically from enslavement to freedom? But what if we actually think about the act of flight itself, right? Our physical, our psychological, our metaphysical, right, understandings of what does it mean to negotiate distance, movement, property, and purpose together. Distance, movement, property, and purpose together. What if the act of not just the result, but what if the actual act itself, the attempt at trying to refashion our condition out of a zone of non-being, what if that's where freedom resides? What if that is actually kind of where freedom resides? And for me, then, when thinking about, I'm only giving a snapshot, but when thinking about not only those historical Maroon communities and contemporary Maroons, but also Frederick Douglass's life and work. Angela Davis, I mentioned as an important, not only kind of scholar activist, but also with regards to a major issue in the 21st century, right? Mass incarceration, right? But also the Rastafari movement, because that will later bring us back to Haile Selassie. But there are different areas, much of which I'm leaving out. These are some of the core that have helped to anchor what I think is a vast set of traditions under the rubric of kind of Black political thought that I still think there has not been enough work to do. And so I want to put one rider to this before moving to your second point, or question rather, which is the term the Black radical tradition, because in some sense you preempted the question of the tension. You were saying this tension between creolization and, wait, if I understood you, you said radical Black thinking. So let me come to that. In 1983, a thinker by the name of Cedric Robinson, incidentally someone who Sylvia Wynter both taught with and corresponded with in many periods when he was alive, an African American, a Black American thinker who was one of the few, actually, during the time in which the book he published in 1983, who even was writing about kind of Maroons and Marronage in his own way, right? In his own way. He published this book called The Black Radical Tradition, no S, right? The Black Radical Tradition, which was on its face a study of his book, Black Marxism, right? The Making of the Black Radical Tradition was on its face a study of the relationship between Marxist political thought, social and political thought, and what he considered this idea that he called the Black radical tradition. And it was very, I mean, it's a massive text, and it's so, for someone who is not trained as a historian, there's such detailed historicism. But what's really fascinating about the book is the first quarter of the book does not actually mention Africans and people of African descent as its anchor. He actually focuses on the Irish in England. That's the majority. The first quarter of the book is on the Irish in England before the encounter between what we now would say is the Atlantic kind of slave trade and Europeans having gone into Africa, the Portuguese slave trade and the like, Spanish slave trade, the English slave trade, the German slave trade. And he makes this argument that there was what he called racialism, a racialism functioning about how Irish in England were being treated, as a segue to then later talk about the advent of the Atlantic slave trade and then the racialization of Africans into kind of Black peoples, kind of racialized as Black peoples. And it's a wonderful book. However, I asked myself, is there a singular Black radical tradition, or even push it further? Is there a single tradition of Black politics that goes from here to there, and it's linear and it's singular? It's linear and it's singular. And I think that what Robinson has done for, mind you, a book that even in Black studies when he was alive, most scholars didn't want to talk about. And then when Robinson passed, now there's all this proliferation of one of the other big terms from the book, racial capitalism, and all of these things. But I think that Robinson raises an important point that Sylvia Wynter raised, and Walter Rodney, and Angela Davis, and also the Maroons and the Rastafari, namely, and Zada Yaka, which we'll get to, namely, is there a heterogeneous Black social and political set of traditions, that there are perhaps some unifying areas, certainly, but then perhaps there is some type of nuance to those that still nonetheless allows us to not completely demarcate, let's say, African thought and African American thought and Afro-Caribbean thought and Afro-British thought and Afro-Japanese thought and the like. That's what I could be wrong, but what I have, as you're right, I have suggested that there's so much work in Anglo-American political theory and philosophy, and European political theory and philosophy, and other intellectual traditions. I can spend my whole life still doing this work and only have scratched the surface. And so I want to be able to, what I've been describing is trying to open the door, and rather an invitation for those not only who agree with me, but those who might actually be inspired to kind of go into this area further, to then think about what is possible. And so when thinking about, to your second point, you mentioned the forward to our mutual colleague and friend Cornel West. book of interviews that he conducted with yourself, that myself and George Yancey, in terms of thinking about the forward and also introductions to a work such as that. For me, what I called, philosophizing the love supreme. I wanted to be able to take out the essence of Cornel West, who is not only a preeminent figure in modern Africana thought, right, and also Black politics, and also thought more broadly, given his intellectual formations. And it's not, we should also really note that Cornel West very much also sees himself in terms of how he understands religion, right? Not just kind of theology, but also religion as in the philosophy of religion as very central to his entire body of work and who he is. He says this always, who he is. Wherever we think about him, who he is, he always begins with that location. I tried to frame this idea that he riffs off of a figure such as John Coltrane, but more broadly, this sense of what really animates this prophetic pragmatism that West speaks of. But in kind of your forthcoming book, Zada Jakob's Inauguration of Modernity and Cardiocentrism, which I should tell the viewers is that in our conversations, I said, I've really learned so much from your wide range of works and interviews, but it was still that first book in Zada Jakob that you did, right? This figure coming out of coming out of Africa, but specifically inaugurating a modern tradition of thinking in what we may call kind of Ethiopia. And that this thinker emerging at the same time, around the same time as a figure like Rene Descartes, that in the European tradition is oftentimes, or courses or books, volumes upon volumes that locate the beginning of modern thought with Rene Descartes. We have this amazing thinker who, for a period of time, is in a cave, right? And is then thinking about not only what do the Psalms mean to him, but also what are these questions of the relation of what we would later call kind of reason to human existence and human life. And that he would locate that he locates, as you brilliantly point out, the heart, right? These are cardiocentrism. The heart is the site for Zada Jakob of reason, and not simply what's in this, right, in our cranium, right, in the brain. Not that the brain is insignificant, but if one actually thinks of the heart, then you can have a situation when people say, follow your heart. Many times that's a profoundly irrational. I want to say that you follow, that's an irrational motive, decision. But reason and rationality are not the same thing, right? That one can think that you're doing something that's irrational. Because if we go back to Frederick Douglass and the Atlantic slave trade, Harriet Jacobs in the African American tradition also wrote about this in incidents in the life of a slave girl. It was 100% irrational to believe that not only you might escape the conditions of plantation slavery. In Douglas's case, that took many moves in his ultimate escape from Maryland Eastern Shore, but in Harriet Jacobs' case, 7 years in the attic, right? In the attic, right? In an attic, 7 years in this garret, 8 foot by 8 foot by 7 foot, around there, abouts. It was irrational to think not only might you exit the plantation, but more broadly to think that the institution of slavery would either not just in their lifetime, but ever come to an end. And yet it did. And so this question, going back to Zada Jakob, inaugurating this modernity in which this idea of the reason coming from the heart, whether or not that is actually our actions are rational, is profoundly interesting to me, because in many regards, I think for someone who wasn't writing a historicist work, it actually maps onto developments in human history. But more important, equally important in the forward to your upcoming book, I tried to meditate on the act of writing itself. Again, I won't go into the argument, but I tried, as you know, I tried to talk about writing. Writing's hard. writing's very hard. Writing's hard for people who have even published very extensively. Writing something that is does not just disappear like instant coffee.
Mm.
Writing something that is going to be provocative, not polemical, right? I mean, in other words, you can be polemical, that's fine, but I mean provocative being something that sparks the imagination of another, and also something that has durability. Ideas that that don't just they're just not fleeting, but that at least for me, at least that have durability. It's hard. So in that forward, without giving it away, I do talk about an important writer in African American letters who themselves made a huge contribution, but then struggled for much the rest of their life to kind of continue to write something new, and then bring that back to Zada Yacob in this moment. Which brings me to the last, your last important and certainly challenging question, which is, which was gesturing to where much of my kind of scholarly inquiries, bigger and scholarly inquiries are related. I mean, one, which I have a forthcoming book, How to Live Free in the Age of Pessimism, which is very much anchored in not just how we get free, but how do we live free in this world. But a study of the late Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. It is absolutely baffling to me that there is a figure such as Haile Selassie that, at least by name, if not by image, is profoundly well known and then substantively not known at all. Right? Not known at all. It is a mystery. In fact, I was asked by Time Magazine in a few months back. There was I would encourage everyone to see this if they haven't, the first ever biopic film on the kind of amazing Jamaican artist and thinker, Nestor Robert Marley, or Bob Marley, as known to most of the world. There was a biopic that, an amazing biopic that finally was made, and in the movie, there are a few scenes in which, very briefly, there is a picture of someone on a horse, right? There's someone on a horse. And twice the person on a horse comes there, and it turns out, for those who are familiar with his background, you would then realize that the person on the horse was supposed to be Bob Marley's father. His father used to go by Captain Marley. He was a white Jamaican, and he went by the name kind of Captain Marley, but he wasn't actually a captain in any military establishment. He just called himself that, and he used to ride on a horse, and he had a particular type of hat on the horse. But then there's a third, I believe it's the third time, near the end of the film, and I won't give away anything else in the film, in which there is then, again, warping back to someone playing Bob Marley as a child, who then is invited to get on a horse with someone. And most people who saw the film were jarred. So I literally got several messages with people who, because I taught, one of the classes I teach is called I teach a kind of class for years on the Rastafari movement, but a separate class on the political theology of Bob Marley. And so I got many people who wrote, who then said, I saw this biopic, it was great, but who was the last? I'm confused. The last person didn't look like they were supposed to be Nesta's father. And sure enough, it was an image of Haile Selassie, because Selassie was known, it was a different hat. Okay. So this is all to say, whether it's listening to kind of reggae music or dancehall music, where you have Selassie, in which, as you said, in terms of within the Rastafari movement, of which Bob Marley was a member of one of the mansions, essentially one of the branches of the faith, that for most Rastafari, Haile Selassie, who was crowned, who assumed on November 2nd, 1930, the throne as Emperor Haile Selassie I, that was the reincarnation. That moment was the prophesied reincarnation and return of Jesus Christ as a black man, right? And that there were these various, there's many, there's kind of many, not just stories of prophesying or historical accounts that there would be a black king, emperor who would be kind of king, not just king, but emperor who would be crowned. And so the kind of proto Rastafari across the Atlantic then said, this is right. This was, as they said, Jah, right? That God had returned, Christ had returned. And so for us, there's many Rastafari who believe in that understanding that Selassie is divine. Then you have many those, particularly in East Africa, and even within what we now call Ethiopia, who see Selassie as, yes, he was this political leader, but he was also an individual for whom, when one thinks about ethnicity, not just race, right, but ethnicity, right, that what would later become not only Somalia but also kind of Eritrea, that even internal to Ethiopia, and not even vis-a-vis those other two nation states, that that he was someone that there are still many who believe was fomented kind of ethnic divisions. And then there are others for whom he was in the 20th century. So zooming out of even Africana thought, one of the foremost advocates of what we would consider kind of the discourse on human rights. Selassie was not only someone who, as we know in terms of his past, there was a challenge to his rule in which there was a period in the 1930s when Italy invaded under Mussolini Ethiopia, and the period in which Selassie was in exile in the UK. Subsequently would return, but at a certain period, Ethiopia, he made appeals to what was then the League of Nations. And then subsequently, he became one of the main architects behind what would become the United Nations, right? And so within human rights discourse, Selassie is a different figure right over there. And then there's just a large amount of people who don't know much about him at all. And to your point, not just books, even articles, beyond very surface information, there is just very little on this complicated figure. And so I think in a lot of ways, trying to at least bring into relief more with more depth and an intellectual history of Haile Selassie I, in many regards, is actually his life, and his life actually brings into relief much of what we just discussed. His life brings into relief much of what we just discussed.
Well, how impressive that you managed to respond to three rather broad questions that could have occupied easily 3 episodes with 1 hour in length. And I'm very grateful. So before we get off the air, I want to let my readers know that the Kiros Report, which used to be called African Ascent First and African Ascent International, and then Excellence, and now I have landed with a new name, which bears my name, the Kiros Report, has published this far a collection of interviews done on the air in the form of 2 books. One book, which we addressed cursorily, with Cornel West, Conversations with Cornel West, to soon be followed in a month or 2, called Conversations with Noam Chomsky. And now with Professor Robert's help, because he has access to prestigious publishers, we're thinking in terms of publishing these 3 interviews that I have done with him over the past 5 years, to be called Conversations with Neil Roberts. How grateful I am that I had you for 1 full hour in what I'm tempted to call an intellectual feast, which is a combination of historical reflections, organizing imaginary tropes and concepts such as realizing, and then revising the singularity of the Black radical tradition by adding that democratizing S, and extracting different theories, different arguments, different visions, different horizons, different perspectives, which reflect the globality and similarities and dissimilarities of Black people's experiences. The Kiros Report is grateful for this particular interview. Thank you for coming and sharing with us your busy time at the Dean of the Faculty, Associate the Faculty at Williams College. I can't wait until Williams College and see you in person.
Thank you very much.